Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everybody, for having us a very special session. We actually committed to the advocacy and making sure that we develop, critical, what do you call, minds in the country, on political marketing. We intend to move to other campuses, not only Legon, but the other university campuses, and it's an agenda that we intend to pursue. So hopefully you will see a lot more numbers. Currently, we are rounding up to about 50 students so far and counting. But yeah, we'll make sure that we do a better job. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk about some of the emerging issues since the last elections. I mean, the 2020 elections, made us understand that there's quite a lot of, there are quite a lot of things, changing in the terrain of political marketing, especially the advent of digitization, if I should put it that way. I mean, in the past, the political parties have actually used, the digitized world, as everybody is using internet, social media, etc. But I think we're seeing quite a lot of twist to that and a lot of issues coming up. And so I'm going to raise some of these issues. Now, in the last election, we saw, a good use of TikTok, Instagram, Twitter was massively used. And then, of course, social media. Now, because of the social, Facebook, because of social media's, anniversary, that anniversary kind of thing that they do over the period, they remind you of what you have said on social media. Now, there is an emerging issue of what we call content appropriation. Now, you find, opposing teams, opposing parties using the words of, their competitors to go after them, to go against them and say, well, you said this, in 2016. Now you have actually changed your position, in 2020 elections. And they were massively used. And, it's easy to go onto Twitter and do a hashtag with the person's name, and it's going to pull a whole lot of history of information, about what they have said. So the political parties have actually been using that to go against each other. And that means that it is going to be difficult in the future for political parties and politicians to control message, because as we saw, in the last election, John Mahama, for example, when the MPP was actually trumpeting the free SHS, also came out to say that, yes, I actually began a free SHS. Of course, they did that in some sort of a trial version. I mean, they didn't actually roll it out completely. However, there was another clip that he had actually said that the free SHS implementation was not possible, which he said that in 2016. So that completely obliterated, his claim that he began that particular policy. And that was difficult, for him to actually defend himself when that tape, was actually brought about. Now, if you look at in the traditional media, I mean, those days when we only have TV and radio, it was going to be difficult for you to go to the national broadcaster and say, well, I remember John Mahama, saying that he didn't believe that free SHS could be implemented. Can you give me that tape? Suddenly, you're not going to get that access. But because of social media, it was easy for people to get that access to that particular tape and then go after him in that sense. So content appropriation is becoming one of the biggest issues, for and against political parties going into the future. And so the point is, as strategists, how are we going to control the message in future? It's very scary for political parties. It can work in both ways. It can work for you. It can work against you. And so as strategists, we must start thinking about how we're going to control the message in the future. And in that sense, it brings about another, issue of campaign forms, which I actually observed, or we observed in the last election. We realized that apart from the official campaign, or call it the formal campaign, there's a huge informal and unofficial campaign emerging within the space. And what do I mean by, informal campaigns? Now, you realize that supporters of the political parties who have expertise in the use of social media are creating content in support and against political parties. So if someone actually supports NDC, as we saw in the last election, there was a gentleman who actually created a campaign song, Mahamafa. He was just an ordinary, supporter of John Mahama, who happened to be a musician. He applied his skills and then came up with a fantastic song. Eventually, the party had to actually, sort of take up that song officially. Meanwhile, they didn't actually sanction him to do that. He did that by himself because he knows how to sing, and you could use the social media. In a twinkle of an eye, that song had actually gone viral, and because of that, the party adopted it. That's a huge, example of what we call the informal campaign. And we saw that for both parties and other political parties as well. A lot of people were doing stuff for their parties or against their parties, within that setting, without being necessarily called upon by the parties to do that. The parties didn't sanction it. Again, when you compare that to the traditional media, those days you cannot go to GBC and say, oh, I've made a song, I want to play it. Of course, it's going to cost you a fortune. So you wouldn't even dare doing it. But because these days social media is very, almost free, and people have creative skills, copywriting skills, they can apply that skills and then roll out a huge, informal campaign, on behalf or against a political party. Again, as strategists, we have to actually think about how we're going to control the campaign going forward, in the future. There's another part of it that I call unofficial campaign, which in the West, in the campaign, you talk about negative campaign attacks, where, maybe a PAC, or a political action group would create a campaign, a negative campaign against a political party or candidate. Now, in the last election, we saw a similar but quite different, which I call campaign mercenaries. All right, we saw people who were used by political parties to launch attack on the other political parties without officially being linked to them. And the typical case is what we had called Papano. Papano became one of the huge, issues that actually the NDC actually faced, which Mahama actually faced. And in this sense, it was an allegation that was, leveled against him. Now, these young ladies, there were two young ladies involved in that particular, action. Now, they never mentioned the candidate of the NDC directly. They kept using his first name, Mahama. Of course, there are so many people called, his surname called Mahama in the country. And because they didn't mention his name directly, John Mahama, but kept saying Mahama, everybody, especially those who do not have that, political sophistication, thought it was their candidate, John Mahama. And what made it worse is that along the line, they brought in the wife's name. The wife is called Lodina, all right? Then they brought Lodina. They didn't say Lodina Mahama, but they said Lodina. Of course, there are so many Lodinas in the country. So how would you respond to that particular attack? You have no way of responding because you haven't been mentioned fully, so you can't take legal action. And you don't know whether it's you or not you, but majority of people actually believe that it was against that particular candidate. How do you actually protect that? How do you actually fight back? How do you actually, protect your candidate along that line? It's a very serious issue that we have to actually start thinking about as political strategies. And again, it was possible because social media, they could use free social media to do that. It was a traditional media, you can't do it. So there is an emerging, what we call, unofficial, unofficial campaign coming on with the use of, mercenaries, I call them, campaign mercenaries, just to attack candidates, and we have to be mindful of. So these are some of the issues that
Kobby, you've got 1 minute left. Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, so that's some of the issues that we're talking about. As a result of digitization, there are quite a lot of issues that are actually coming up, content appropriation, unofficial, official campaigns, informal campaigns. How do we handle those as strategists? We have to start thinking about them. Thank you.